So let's begin. So we're looking at the writing of George Ritzer, Global Economic Flows, and he is going to try and explain to us how commodities and money and finances and value chains operate across the globe. The reading itself is slightly old, it's slightly out of date. The reading in your reading package was from, I think, 2010. I sent you one from 2015. Nonetheless, it's important to remember that wherever you encounter facts and figures, you must look at the date of those facts and figures and also look at the date of publication, because obviously, sometimes we give you readings that are slightly old, and the data in those readings, the statistics may be slightly old. So what we're looking at today is global trade. The first thing to understand and recognize about global trade is that it's called global trade, and it is in some sense global in the sense that there's trade occurring all over the globe. Okay, you didn't go from the center. Thank you. Cheti, Hadi, come on. All right, you're interrupting the flow here, man. All right, so although trade is global in the sense that nearly every country is trading on the global market, but the vast majority of this trade is actually between certain countries and certain regions of the globe. So you can see more than half of the world trade occurs between high income areas such as Japan, the US and Western Europe, as well as China. That's really where global trade is. More than half of global trade is really between these four regions of the world. Once again, that's US, Japan, Europe, and China. That's where most of global trade is occurring. About 60 countries are dependent on commodities for more than 40% of their export income. In some African countries, the figure can be as high as 80%. So there is a very high degree of interdependence and interdependent relations. If you recall from your last reading, we said that what distinguishes modern globalization from ancient, archaic, or older forms of globalization is precisely the degree of interdependence that's created as a consequence of modern global trade. And you can see that in the facts and figures here. So one of the things that the author wants to talk about are trade deficits and surplus. Every economy cares about trade deficits and surplus. Pakistani economy, for example, suffers enormously from trade deficits. Every single year, with the exception maybe of 1 or 2 years in our history, we've always run trade deficits. And the result of those trade deficits, of course, is that we need dollars in order to buy oil, to buy military hardware, to buy machines, to buy other things, etc., to buy, well, our Apple phones and our consumer luxury items as well, etc., to buy cars, all of those things. Where do those dollars come from? They come from multilateral international organizations like the International Monetary Fund. They can come from commercial or non-commercial banks. They can come from other sources such as governments, like, for example, Saudi Arabia gave us $6 billion in oil credits and so on. But every time they come from these sources, there are obviously going to be certain conditions, or to use a metaphor, there are going to be certain strings attached. There are always going to be certain issues that come with nobody gives you free money. When they give you money, it's for a particular reason, or they want it back, and so on. So it's never without certain conditions and stipulations. So trade deficit, one of the interesting things about the international trade today, and this has become very much part of international politics today, is that the US has a massive trade deficit with China. Okay, total US imports from China are 300 and almost 400 billion. Total US exports to China are only about 110 billion, etc. So China is sending a lot of stuff to the US, and what the US is importing mainly from China are computers, cell phones, apparel, and footwear. And what the US is sending to China are things like commercial aircraft, soybeans, automobiles, and so on. And this becomes a very central issue in US politics with respect to China. What are we going to do about the trade deficit? Should we continue having it? Should we eliminate it? And so on. All right. So one of the important things we got to understand is what we mean by economic chains, economic networks, supply chains, international production networks, global commodity chains, and global value chains, all of which are kind of closely related to each other, not too different. So supply chains, value-adding activities in the production process, beginning with raw materials and ending with a finished product. Not too hard to understand. You have cotton production, cotton gets converted into yarn, yarn gets converted into cloth, etc. Cloth gets converted into a commodity, into clothes, etc. That gets sold, and so on and so forth. So that's a supply chain which has now become global. All of this used to occur, of course, in the context of one locality or in the context of one market or in the context of one nation. Now it's become, these supply chains have become global. And these have established international production networks of producers involved in producing and finishing products. So that means that there may be a network of producers that make semiconductors and chips and consumer electronic things, and there may be a network of producers that are operating in the textile industry and so on and so forth. Similarly, we have global commodity chains. Here we are concerned with the commodities themselves and how they move across the globe. So these are also value-adding chains, global industries and the sellers of global products. But when we look at these things, we look at it from the point of view of what is being produced, where is it traveling, what is it doing. And finally, we have global value chains, which is just a different way of examining or looking at the same phenomena, which is various phases of production, delivery to final consumers, and final disposal. The reason why we're interested in value chains per se is we want to see at what point in the process of production and final distribution or sale, etc., is the value being added to that particular commodity. Where is the value being added? And what you discover is that the reason why this is so relevant is that you discover that things that are made in the third world are given to the first world for a certain amount of money, and when the things that are already produced, like a jacket or whatever, when this jacket goes into the US and is sold there, or into the European market and is sold there, it sells at 10 times the price at which we gave it to that particular producer, right? So the major value addition seems to occur, or accrue rather, at that end rather than at the end of the third world producer, etc. So that's why it's very important not just to look at where the commodities are flowing, but what is happening to the value within those commodities. Where is it being added and where is it being accumulated? So the author then talks about some very interesting commodities themselves and their sort of network and how that works. First one, I hope you read this because it was fascinating, is scrap metal. Scrap metal. Okay, so all the things that we have, especially cars are made up of a lot of metal. What happens to all of that metal once the car is obsolete and you go and you sell that car or you dump it or whatever and you buy a new car? What happens to that metal? It gets recycled. About 2/3 of the steel made in the US comes from recycled steel rather than from iron ore and coke, that is virgin steel. Similarly, China uses scrap metal for its own domestic uses as well. So a lot of this is recycled where? In China. The steel, these big cars, these big American cars, they go to China, they're broken down into little parts, and then the steel is reused. By the way, there's an awesome and incredible ship-breaking industry in Pakistan. We call it an industry, but I don't think we should call it an industry, because you're from Karachi, you may know about it. We call it an industry, but it's not really an industry. What it is these gigantic old ships come to the harbor, right? And then you have scores of workers with hammers and, pickaxes and other things. Just with their hands, they go up, they climb up on these machines, on these ships like ants, and then they tear the whole thing apart with nothing but, their hands and their hammers and their shovels and their pickaxes and so on. पूरी की पूरी जहाज को वो फड़का के रख देते हैं. They break it down into all the little parts, and then of course that can be utilized as scrap metal. So huge industry, very poorly paid and very bad working conditions. Almost no safety equipment, etc. Is available to these workers. But my God, the way they break down these massive ocean liners is just itself quite phenomenal in my opinion. Similarly, we have waste paper recycling. That's also huge. One of the richest women in the world is Zhang Yin of the Nine Dragons Paper Company. What an awesome name, Nine Dragons Paper Company. Anyway, so you can imagine how massive waste paper recycling is. So when you recycle waste paper, it often becomes cardboard and other sorts of paper, which is not necessarily as white and as pure, etc., but it has a lot of uses, especially packing and so on and so forth. T-shirts, shocking to think about that. The global value chain here involves cotton grown in and shipped from the US, T-shirts manufactured in China or Bangladesh, and they're shipped to the US, which they are eventually disposed, people wear them and then they dispose of them, which happens very quickly as opposed to third world countries. You wear a t-shirt, it's a year old, you throw it away, etc. And finally, the shipping and sale of those used t-shirts into Africa. And here's the interesting part. When those used t-shirts go back to Africa, they actually have a pretty negative impact on the African economy, where manufacture of t-shirts is very negatively impacted. So t-shirts is also a huge sort of recycling global chain sort of network. And of course, the iPhone is the classic example of something that's produced globally. You can see the global supply chain here. The phone is conceptualized and created in the US. The processor is produced in Texas. The advanced semiconductors come from Germany and Taiwan. Memory from Korea and Japan. Display panels and circuitry from Korea and Taiwan. Chipsets from Europe and rare metals from Africa and Asia. The phone is finally assembled in China by companies like Foxconn, which employs 1.2 million Chinese workers. Million! Oh my God, that's massive. They're basically pretty much assembling all the phones that we are using all over the globe, like millions and millions of phones, right? So a great example of a global supply chain. And by the way, Apple now is worth, I think, $2 trillion. That is about 8 times the total GDP of everybody in the total income of everybody in Pakistan. The total GDP of Pakistan is 262 billion or something of that sort. They are 8 times the size of Pakistan, just one company. And there are several companies like that that are larger than our country, and many, many countries put together, in fact. So, in the global scheme of things, companies, global multinational companies today are richer, wealthier, and therefore actually, in a certain sense, more powerful than governments themselves. This is a very, very unique situation in the globe today. Now, everybody talks about free markets and the benefits of free markets, and globalization is all about trading and free markets, and protectionism must be undone, and so on and so forth. But there is a big debate that first world countries, specifically the United States of America, still continues to protect certain key industries, whereas it asks everybody else to not protect those industries. They themselves don't follow what they preach. So do as I tell you, don't do as I do, sort of thing. US government subsidies, for example, distort the global market and give American producers a tremendous advantage, specifically with respect to agriculture. So they have $4 billion, this was in 2000, now it's changed. So billions of dollars are spent in subsidizing agriculture in the United States of America. Brazil was very upset with this. They went to the WTO. The WTO heard the case and ruled against the US and said, yes, you are engaging in unfair trade practices. The US simply ignored what the WTO had to say. Similarly, the United States has what is called the multi-fiber agreement, which puts quotas on the number of t-shirts that can be imported into the US from various producing countries, and this is basically set up against China. The main purpose of the law was to prevent China from garnering all or close to all of that market. From between 1995 and 2007, the US exported nearly 9 billion pounds of used clothing and other worn textile products to the rest of the world. However, the used clothing imports were found to have a negative impact on apparel production in Africa. This is what I was saying during the previous slide, explaining roughly 40% of the decline in production and 50% of the decline in employment over the period 1981 to 2000. So the used things that get sent to the third world, we might think, oh, this is great, we're getting all these cheap used things. But in fact, they destroy local production, specifically have destroyed local production in Africa. So, on the other hand, with respect to used things, China has a very unique strategy. China concluded that it was far cheaper to buy dated factories from Germany or other places like that instead of building new ones from scratch. So what they said was, they said to the German government, oh, you have a factory which is no good, or they said to a private producer, you have a factory which is out of date, it's not producing up to speed, it's not efficient, etc. Give it to us. We will use it. And what they do is they send their Chinese workers to, let's say, a place like Germany, Frankfurt, or whatever, and they will take apart that factory. They will first go into the factory. This is quite amazing. And they label everything item by item. So they, you have a desk, they label the desk. They'll have a chair, they label the chair. You have a computer over here, they label the computer. Everything is first labeled, right? And they put it in a massive chart, you can imagine. everything is labeled, and then everything is disassembled and shipped into boxes. In boxes is shipped to China, and there it is by label, reassembled, tuck, 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 like Lego, exactly the way it was in Germany. Quite an amazing process. And the Chinese, they build and rebuild things at a phenomenal rate. It's just incredible to see some of those time-lapse footages. Kabhi aapne dekhi hai YouTube pe? You can see how they build a factory in 17 days, how they build when the COVID crisis occurred, they built a hospital in 2 weeks, a full 2,000 bed hospital, tuck, 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 tuck. They built it in just 2 weeks. It's amazing. Okay, so automobiles, China has become the world's largest automobile manufacturer, which is quite strange and funny because US is supposed to be the land of automobiles, right? US culture prides itself on being an automobile culture. They built these big roads, etc. Unlike Europeans who say, no, we're socialist or we're social democratic and we like public transport, etc. The Americans are like, oh, to hell with that. This is about individualism and my car is my individuality and expresses my personality and so on. So anyway, but now today, China is the largest manufacturer. They produced almost 1 out of every 4 cars sold in the world. It's probably, may even be higher today, I'm not sure. But you can see a quarter of global production of cars is done in China. What China really has accomplished is quite a turnaround. And I don't think there's any other third world country that has turned around in quite the way that China really has turned around in the last couple of decades. You can see this graph over here. The blue line is the United States of America and the red line is the People's Republic of China. Between 2008 and 2011, China was growing between 9.2 and 10%. US economy was slowing down and then grew at 2.2%. China accounted for 40% of the increased global demand for oil in 2012. China has approximately 1/5 of the world's population, but it consumes almost half of global cotton production, almost half of coal production, and almost 40% of aluminum production. So this has become, China is today really the factory, the workshop of the world, which was once a phrase that was used for Great Britain, for England. That today is now China, but on as some authors like to say, on an Asiatic scale, on a vast scale involving millions and millions of people. So, next up, what's happening with oil? We've talked about iPhones, we've talked about automobiles, we've talked about t-shirts and waste paper and steel. Now let's talk about one of the most important commodities in the global economy, which is oil. Increased demand from China and India especially is playing a huge role in pushing up the price of oil on the world market. However, the Chinese and the Indians say, why are you blaming us? You're the ones who are using more oil and we are industrializing and we need these things. So stop blaming global oil production or the rise in global oil production solely on us, etc. Of course, this has meant that some countries have had a huge bump in terms of the amount of money that they're able to earn. I'll show you the data just in a bit, but here's a mention of a few countries. Abu Dhabi Investment Authority invested $7.5 billion in the American-based City Corporation, and with that investment became one of the country's largest shareholders. In 2010, they acquired Harrods department store in London for 2.3 billion, etc. So they're buying up real estate and other things. And if you go to London, especially if you go to Edgware Road, you can see this process happening, that there are a lot of Middle Eastern people who live there. That's the place to go if you want to have good shawarmas and Middle Eastern food, etc. They're on Edgware Road, and but they're buying up properties in London, in New York, and many other parts of the world. Russia, which was experiencing just the worst economic depression that you can ever imagine, is today has a lot more money under Putin, etc. Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez, was using this oil wealth to support his programs for socialism, for free healthcare, education, and other things. Angola, which very poor country and went through decades of civil war, is also getting better thanks to oil production. So, but the increased price of fuel also means that people are also looking for alternatives. One of the alternatives they're looking for is ethanol. So you can produce fuels through agriculture. The other alternative is shale oil. And then, of course, there's all the green technology that we have. Solar power, wind power, water power, hydropower, and other forms of green technology, which is more expensive, obviously, but more sustainable as well. So this is just a graph of the world market price for oil. You can see this is till 1970, and then this is the OPEC crisis, quote unquote crisis, because the West it was a crisis, for the Middle East it wasn't a crisis at all, it was a bonanza, right? So after OPEC, you can see boom, the price of oil goes all the way up, and all in this entire period, Middle Eastern countries are just booming with money. They're just making so much money that they don't even know what to do with it. And mostly they well, in the early period, they didn't really spend it on anything useful. But nowadays, they are sort of trying to diversify their economy. I mean, they mainly spent it on building roads and big houses and so on and so forth. But nowadays, they're trying to diversify by building more educational institutions and and diversifying the economy. Take, for example, Prince Suleiman, who in Saudi Arabia has argued that we're too dependent on oil and we've got to diversify, we've got to have tourism, and we've got to open up to the world and create these new cities and so on and so forth. So that's what's going on here. You can see the price of oil comes back down, fluctuates around here, and then again in 2000, boom, the price of oil rises like crazy. And this is really what helps to generate or regenerate money for Russia, Venezuela, and Angola, and also the Middle East naturally. So that's what the price of oil is doing. The movement of the price of oil can impact many countries, as you can imagine, and the global flow of commodities, etc. Here you have the Arab Springs and other such movements that began in 2011. People who were protesting the concentration of oil wealth, the fact that oil wealth was being used by a few families, etc., was owned by those families, used by those families. It ought to belong to the nation, it ought to be spent on the people, etc. So after years of protests, etc., governments seem to be, at least in terms of rhetoric, more willing to spend that money in various social programs, etc., especially to diversify. I think they are quite keen and to diversify their economies from oil and to have so that they are not solely dependent on one commodity. Yes.
So when they stopped relying on oil, that's when you said that the prices of oil fell, right, in the previous graph. Mm-hmm. But then why did the boom come again?
Oh, so I didn't say that the fall was because of that. I think the fall has, there are other factors behind the fall. But the incline after 2000 is driven by the industrialization of China and also the opening up of India. There is also an incline that's as a consequence. This is increased demand over the globe, right? And so the increased demand is driven by a consistent rise in US demand. US is also a huge oil consumer, the largest in fact. And so that's also on the incline. But the way at which China is sort of catching up with that is really massive as well. India too, but India not so much. China especially, okay? So that's what the whole debate is about, that this incline in oil prices is driven mainly by, whether it's driven mainly by India or China, or whether it continues to be driven by the major oil consumers, the West and the United States of America. Now here's another interesting, really funny story about oil, which is, really weird story about oil, which is that the large producers of oil domestically have industrialized, having made a lot of money from oil, they've industrialized, they've tried to diversify their economy, etc. They've built massive infrastructures, roads, etc., etc. They've imported cars and the rest of it. Now the producers of oil are in turn also importing oil. So they're not just exporting, they are the producers, but they're also saying, no, sell us oil because we need more oil than we are ourselves able to produce. So US has been in that situation for a very long time. It's one of the largest consumers of oil. It also produces oil. It also imports a huge amount of oil. It's just an oil guzzling machine, you can imagine. Recently, by the way, this decline that you saw at the last end here, over here, this decline that you're seeing is a consequence of the processing of shale oil, which the Americans are now able to do. And this, of course, negatively impacts both Russia as well as Venezuela. The Venezuelan economy, which was doing so well under Hugo Chavez, when this happened, began to suffer enormously. Conspiracy theorists will tell you that the Americans discovered shale oil purposely to, put down Venezuela and Russia and so on and so forth. But the reality is, I think that America just has a very, very vast demand for oil, and they want to fulfill that from wherever they can find it. So this is, from an environmentalist point of view, really quite disturbing, because for the inevitable reason that all of this oil production is has an extremely negative impact on climate change and the environment. Here is a certain interesting graph that I thought I'd share with you. Here's North America, and you can see all the flows of oil coming into the US, whereas there's also some export of oil, you can see, to China as well as to Europe. You can see South America over here, mainly exporting oil to US, to Europe, and also to China again. China is pretty much getting oil from everybody, as you can see, right? They're just sucking it all up or whatever. Russia exporting oil both this way, that way, as even to the United States of America, to Europe, and to China. And Middle East, of course, being in the center, proliferating out. There's also oil in Africa, specifically in Nigeria, there's a lot of oil. So the politics of oil still remains very, very important, despite one of the articles we read in the last class about oil being less important now than it was in the past. But one of the things that it impacts, oil impacts everything. Oil prices impact everything. One of the key things that oil prices impact are food prices. So you can see over here that food prices seem to be going up over here. And it is, in fact, you can see a sort of trend. You can more or less draw some sort of a trend here that it seems to be going up. So one of the reasons why food prices are or could be going up is because the rise in the cost of transportation of food means that food becomes more expensive. This is extremely problematic for the obvious and simple reason that then when food prices go up, people starve, people die. And that can't be a good thing, can it? Also, when food prices go up, the price of labor also goes up. The whole economy sort of ends up in a very different way. All right, so let's have a look at the dynamics of inviting investment from abroad. You will often hear Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi politicians tell you, I am going to bring foreign investment into Pakistan. This is what I'm going to do. मैं सरमायाकारी करके दिखाऊंगा, वगैरह वगैरह. बाहर से सरमायादार आएगा, यहाँ पे सरमायाकारी होगी, multinational companies आएंगी, वगैरह वगैरह. So what you need to do in order to invite multinational companies to your country is actually that you have to offer lower wages, you have to offer poorer working conditions, longer hours of work, less environmental regulation, and ever escalating demands and pressure, etc. So we can call this a race to the bottom. Third world countries are often competing with each other to offer the best circumstances for capital to earn as much profits as they can. Now here's something that might shock you, which is Turkey is here. In terms of textiles, Turkey is right here at the top. It might shock you to discover that China is also really, really up here, high up here, right? So these are global wages. Ethiopia naturally is down here at 26. Myanmar, Bangladesh, Laos, etc., etc. The reason why I say it might shock you is because despite the fact that real wages are actually quite high in China, a lot of investment still goes into China. And that's because, despite the higher real wages, and that's because China can provide an infrastructure for a rapid turnover, which a country like Ethiopia is unable to provide. It can provide skilled manpower on a scale which Ethiopia is unable to provide. So that's one of the key things, that despite the higher wages in China, capital still prefers to go to China because of the other benefits it continues to get. Industrial upgrading is the process through which your industry becomes more technologically up to date. Maquiladoras is often given as an example. They began as assembly sites based on cheap labor, and now they are manufacturing centers, etc. You can say Pakistan also started with, producing completely unfinished cotton, etc., just selling unfinished cotton, and now we're able to semi-process it, make it into garments, etc., etc. But please remember that this is a very small change in terms of the technological base of these societies. It's not a massive change in terms of the technological base, because all the things that are sort of the high end of the technological spectrum stay focused in the first world. So, but is there industrial upgrading as a consequence of the movement of capital from the first world to the third world? Well, Professor Pietra Rivoli thinks that that is the case. That in fact, if you look at she argues that if you look at industrialization All of these people were in a race to the bottom. In fact, it was England, especially Manchester, where the Industrial Revolution starts in textiles, that won the race to the bottom. And then it was US, specifically New Hampshire and Charlotte and North Carolina. By the way, I've been to North Carolina. I was a trade union organizer in North Carolina. Japan, etc., Hong Kong, that had very low wages, and that's why there was an ignition switch, and then the motor started, and then things sort of just rolled from there. But this is hotly debated, and it's strongly contested, because it's not necessarily the case that if you have extremely low wages and really bad working conditions, that number one, capital will even come to those societies or those areas. You might have too much political instability. You might have terrorism. You might have extremism. You might just have a really bad image of your country as a place that if you come and work here, if you're in Sialkot or something, you might get lynched because you took down a TLP poster, right? Who's going to come after that? Very few people. Even if you offer really low wages, they're like, man, I don't want to get lynched. I'm not going to Pakistan, right? So those things can have a very bad impact on the movement of capital as well. So anyway, Ritzer says that it's no guarantee of adaptive upgrading, but it is a guarantee of low wages and poverty for an unknown amount of time. So this theory is not very strong, according to Ritzer. Outsourcing is a huge part of modern globalization. It's obviously activity in which you take a certain process within your factory or your production process, and you give it to somebody who's not inside the factory, who does it on a piece rate basis perhaps. They are not directly your employee. You're not paying them a wage. You give them a certain amount of work and you say, all right, you do this work and I will pay you per piece for this work. I'll buy the piece from you. So outsourcing obviously first begins when factories themselves in a given area will say, a lot of times to avoid labor laws, they will say, okay, we're not going to do this. We're going to get somebody on the outside to do it and then sell it to us. And that way they can evade a lot of the labor laws. They don't have to say, we're hiring 10,000 people. They say, we're only hiring 2,000 people. The rest of the 8,000 people, the work is being outsourced to other people. Okay? Now this can happen and does happen at a global scale now. It happens on a global scale. So it's offshore outsourcing. In other words, not just moving out of the factory anymore, it's moving out of the country altogether. Right? And a great example of this are call centers. Gujarat, for example, had a lot of call centers. I know a lot of students in Islamabad at Quaid-e-Azam University who work in call centers, etc. These are, and a lot of times the people who work in call centers are quite educated from third world countries, because you need to be able to speak good English and so on and so forth. So, these are college students and college graduates who are working in call centers. In my opinion, that's kind of a waste of their intellectual potential. Because call center is not a very technical job in the sense that it's a very technical job in the sense that you have to deal with customers who are angry about something or the other. But it's not a technical job in the sense that there are no enormous positive technological externalities that come out of it. There are no great technological discoveries that come out of call centers. Unlike manufacturing, where in manufacturing, you're always looking at how to increase productivity of a given machine. So you're always looking at how to further develop and improve that particular machine. So some would even argue that motherhood is being outsourced. Childcare can be outsourced, but motherhood is being globally outsourced in the sense that Israeli couples, for example, ask Indian women to be their surrogate mothers, etc. Even war, if motherhood can be outsourced, even war can be outsourced, and you can just get other countries to do the fighting for you. Having trouble in Afghanistan with respect to the Taliban? No problem. We're going to give a bunch of money to somebody and they can help us solve it, etc. So the coalition of the willing, which was the great anti-terror coalition, is referred to by Ritzer as a coalition of the billing. Sir, itna bill aaya hai, zara paise dete hain. So that can also happen. Of course, what that says about third world countries is sadly that those states then become little more than mercenaries. Yeah. All right, so that's Schumpeter there for you. And he has this theory called creative destruction. And he says capitalism is a system in which you experience creative destruction. What that means is there's things being destroyed, there's things being undermined, but it's part of a creative process. For example, there's a famous saying, you can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs. So yes, people are being moved from one part to the other, land is being acquired for shopping malls. What was that new project that just got shut down by the courts in Pakistan? The Ravi development project that got shut down, and then Mr. Imran Khan said, no, it's a great project, we must have it, etc. And people were like, dude, you're the prime minister of the country, not a real estate agent, please don't do such things, etc., right? So the Ravi project is an example. And there can be many, many other examples. So yes, capitalism is on the one hand incredibly destructive. Schumpeter agrees. We can't deny that. But it destroys in order to build something, etc. So neoliberals really like this idea. And they're saying, look, this process of outsourcing is also an example of creative destruction. Millions of jobs have been lost in the US. It's true. But these jobs are being upgraded, new jobs are being created, new technology is being created, etc., etc. The counter argument to that, of course, is that the new jobs that are being created are worse than the jobs that existed before. They're paying less. They're not even as skilled as the jobs that were before. There is de-skilling of the labor forces occurring. They are irregular jobs. They're not regular 9-to-5 jobs. They don't offer social security and healthcare and other things, etc. They're outsourced jobs, etc. Really bad working hours and so on. And secondly, the creativity is occurring in China and the destruction is occurring of the US manufacturing sector, say many people. So that process of creation and destruction is not necessarily always equal. You could also argue that a lot of destruction is occurring in Africa and the third world, and all the benefits are accruing to the first world. So there again, the destruction is pushed into one part, either the working class people or third world people, third world countries, and the benefits accrue to others, and that's not fair. When we look at financial globalization, there's a wonderful saying, when the American economy sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And we saw that in the 2008 financial crisis, which was the worst financial crisis the world has seen since the Great Depression of the 1930s. You see, from 1975 till the starting of the 21st century, the ratio of American household debt to income was doubling. So American households were going more and more into debt for the last 30, 40 years. When there was a big dot-com bubble, a lot of people were investing in Google and Facebook and so on. That burst. When that burst, people moved all that money from the dot-com bubble into the housing market, into real estate. And at the same time, in 1999, the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, which allowed investment banks and commercial banks to merge with each other. Now, this created a situation where banks could now make very, very risky loans to people on the mortgages of their houses. Even if somebody could not pay back their mortgage, they would still give them the money to build a house. The idea that banks had was that people don't ever not pay their mortgage on the whole, because it's their house, it's so important to them, that's the first thing they do. And although there may be some people who may not be able to pay back in time, we can reschedule their loans, but the bulk of people will pay back, and as incomes continue to rise, and people continue to make money, they'll be able to pay back these mortgages. It didn't work out that way. Incomes stagnated, of working class people, stagnated, and debts accumulated, and at a certain point in time, people could not pay back their mortgages. And that meant that banks now had to foreclose. They had to take over the houses. They started taking over the houses. But of course, when they were taking over, there were two other problems with that. Number one was that in America, they created these things called collateralized assets. What that meant was they took a lot of different mortgages, put them together as one major asset, and although the mortgages were really, really bad, they said that since these were house mortgages, people would eventually be able to pay them back. As a collective, as an average, it was good to go. It was a good investment. And then they sold these investments to other people, to other banks, etc., to other investors, etc., etc. So when the housing market collapsed, the fact that you had so many bad loans and that you had collateralized debt on top of that, collateralized assets of bad loans that were considered to be really, really good but were actually really bad, meant that the entire financial industry now completely, the floor fell out from the financial industry. So subprime mortgage crisis meant, subprime means that these were bad mortgages. People couldn't pay them back. meant that the housing market collapsed. When the housing market collapsed, the whole financial sector began to collapse. And when the financial sector in the US began to collapse, the whole global economy began to collapse. It's a huge, massive crisis. Okay, so you can see this simple cartoon here that helps to explain how that process occurred. Okay, so what lessons do we learn from this? Well, one of the very important and powerful lessons that economists have learned from it, hopefully they've learned it, is that, I don't know if they have, but I hope they've learned it, is that neoliberal deregulation is not necessarily a good thing. Right? We have been saying free the markets and let everything go and the market will adjust itself, etc., etc. No, that's not what happened. In fact, what happened was that deregulation, it's supposed to make people more efficient, but what we saw in practice in real life is that it leads to corruption, it leads to malpractice, and it leads to massive financial crisis. Because when the financial sector was deregulated, it just made loans that could never be paid back. It made risky investments that were just going to fall, and when they did, the whole economy collapsed with it. Now, major banks, Citicorp, Washington Mutual, and other financial institutions, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, etc., AIG, had to be nationalized. There had to be bailouts of these huge corporations. UK Northern Rock Bank had to be nationalized. Greece was completely destroyed by this 2008 financial crisis and had to undo its entire welfare state as a consequence. Another very interesting recent development in the global political economy is the idea of sovereign wealth funds. If you remember, when the PTI first came to government, their advisor, Mr. Asad Omar, said, you know what we're going to do to save the economy of Pakistan? We are going to create a Pakistani sovereign wealth trust, and that's going to, people will want to invest, and that's just going to change everything around. He was so enthusiastic about it. You know, Singapore has done it, and Abu Dhabi has done it, and we are going to do it too. I made a short video on that. I said, sir, baat ye hai, Janabe Ali, Sarkar, baat ye hai, ki those countries had enormous surpluses. They took those surpluses and they created a wealth fund out of those surpluses. You are in debt. You don't have a surplus, you have a deficit. You create a sovereign wealth fund, who's going to invest in it? You have no money to invest in it. And why would anybody else take their money and put it into Pakistan? I have no idea. So anyway, so what are the big sovereign welfare trust, funds? They include the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, the government of Singapore, China Investment Corporation. These are the big ones you can see over here. Some of them are dependent on oil. Some of them are non-commodity, that is, no single commodity is dominating that particular wealth fund. But you can see most of them are thanks to oil and gas over here as well. So these are the big oil producers that have these big sovereign wealth. And what this is a kind of state capitalism. Because the state has this money. It's owned by the state. And the state will then invest that money in other corporations, in other countries, in other parts of the world. They'll maybe set up even factories themselves, or they may give money to other factories, or they may invest in other factories, and et cetera, et cetera. That depends on who manages the fund and how they manage it. So they may be producing things like phones or CDs or whatever. This is the government producing it, the state producing it. So this is a kind of massive state capitalism that we see emerging in the global political economy. Next up, what about ideas and people? Well, corporate culture has really changed culture in a very big way. First and foremost, there are changes in the structure of corporations in this period of globalization. In the old period, you had what was called the Taylorist Fordist model, which was a hierarchical organization, a top-down sort of organization, where all the planning would occur at the center. That's what Taylor sort of, in his studies of time management, suggested, that the time a worker takes to go from one place to another must be minimized, and the decisions about where things are placed and how things are placed must be centralized in one planning bureau. Similarly, you have Fordism, which is, of course, assembly line production. You can have, the famous saying is, you can have any color you like of my car as long as the color is black. You can have any color as long as it's black. Because he only made black cars. Because it was easy to make just one kind of car. Well, now that's changing. How is that changing? Well, we have specially driven by IT corporations. IT is an area in which new kind of corporate structure can more easily be introduced. What is it? A more flat kind of structure rather than hierarchical. Network organizations rather than, again, hierarchical organizations. Virtual organizations. And you have now what's called Web 2.0, which is more user-generated content, more peer-generated content, peer learning, peer production, etc., etc. So this is possible, certainly in IT, but it may not be possible everywhere. It's not possible perhaps in automobile production, etc. Now, along with that, management ideas have also changed. The culture has changed. A whole host of management consultants now are on the net telling you how to run your company better. Management gurus are taking lakhs and lakhs of rupees to come and give you a lecture about how to manage. There are management fashions, how to, what's the fashionable thing with respect to management today. You don't really think of management as being fashionable, but there you have it. But this is introducing a more American corporate culture, let's say. American corporate culture is you can wear jeans, it doesn't matter. British corporate culture was, if you're not in a suit and tie, get out of the office. But American corporate culture, sort of you can come in your chappals even, it doesn't matter. You can see it in the movies, etc., right? MBA. What? MBA, जिस पे ये university बनी है, right? It was the MBA program of LUMS. LUMS was basically just an MBA program, by the way, when it started in the 1980s. And it started in Gulberg, in a little home, in a house in Gulberg, where then Lahore School of Economics now exists. It started there. And it was the first to introduce this new program, MBA, which came in the 1980s. उससे पहले MBA नहीं होता था. Did you know that? You thought it existed since the 19th century, or it existed since the time of Julius Caesar. No, it came in the 1980s, okay? And the whole pedagogy of the MBA is very different from this pedagogy that you're experiencing here. It's all based on case studies. Do case studies, case studies, case studies, case studies, right? No lectures, etc., etc. So the whole educational model then also underwent a change because of the MBA program. Other people also started to use the same technology. One of the things was, of course, PowerPoint presentations that were very common in MBA programs, which I have taken, I admit, I accept. Guilty as charged. So business training, like business itself, is becoming more and more global. If you're feeling tired, please don't worry. I only have 20 more slides to go. No, I'm kidding. I only have 5 more slides to go. Okay. One very big thing about the global economy today, political economy today, is the idea of a consumer society. We've shifted from being a producer society. So, for example, what defined you, what was your identity was your work. So somebody would ask you, sir, what do you do? And you would say, well, I'm a university teacher, I'm very proud of it. Except instead of being defined by the work you do, what defines you now is what you are consuming. Are you an Apple user or a Samsung user? It makes all the difference in the world, right? And what we have with that is, number one, a phenomenon, if you want to write that down, hyperconsumption. Hyperconsumption is buying more than one can afford. This little thing over here, oh my God, it's a very dangerous thing, okay? Use very carefully. When I was in college, they used to just send this credit card out to people. And all you had to do was, I think you just had to scratch the back and do something, call somebody, and it would get activated automatically. And throughout college, I never used a credit card because I was just like, man, this thing is evil. Throw it away from me, keep it away from me. Now I have to use it, of course, because, well, there are some things that one wants to buy that one cannot but buy on a credit card. So yeah, I've been corrupted by capitalism, you could say. But the point nonetheless is, it's very easy for you to buy things when you don't have enough money to buy them with a credit card. I never do that, by the way, let me tell you, and I don't want you ever to do that. Don't do that, okay? Don't go into debt, except maybe if it's college or student debt. That's the only kind of debt that you can, go into, but because education is important. But other than that, to buy a phone or to do all these things, please, just use the, dumb phone. Don't get a smartphone if you don't have the money. But anyway, hyperconsumption is very much part of this new globalized world. Spending more than you have, getting things on credit, and then paying baad mein. Let's see. And hyper debt, of course. Owing more than one is able to repay also becomes. And then debt restructuring and so on, and all the bills and tension that come with that. So there has been a tendency to closely associate consumption as well as globalization with Americanization. Because this is very much part of the way in which the American consumer economy operates. In fact, for instance, the reading points out that in British culture, it was considered really horrible to be in any kind of debt whatsoever. Because old aristocratic culture did not allow you to be under anybody's obligation. But now even British culture has changed, people using credit cards to the extent that they are unable to pay back their debts, etc., etc. So culture globally is changing in this particular way. So there is also, of course, increasing amount of consumption in terms of services, legal services, accounting services, education services, what you call it, Kareem, and Uber is a great example of globalized services on the phone, etc. Now one of my friends has created this service where you are able to get a lawyer on wakilonline.com it's called. If you ever need a lawyer, you can go to Wakil Online, get a lawyer. You don't have to go anywhere to get a lawyer, just go on your phone and you get a lawyer, etc. So that's an example of legal services. There's another example of healthcare services. Sehat.com is one of my friends has put that up, where you can get a doctor to consult with on your phone. And it's just, and you say, okay, put the thermometer in your mouth, etc. I'm joking. Educational services, yours truly, of course, is, put up, well, we'll be putting up this video online, etc. Although mine is a free thing, I don't, it's not a service in that sense. It's just, I put up the lectures and whoever wants to watch them can watch them. But anyway, brands become very central in this. There's a wonderful book by Naomi Klein called No Logo, taking aim at the brand bullies. And what really gets under my skin sometimes is when I'm watching a really nice movie and there's a really emotional scene and the girl is, running, Simran or whatever, running to Shahrukh, or is it the other way around? Shahrukh running, I forget. Anyway, the point is they're running towards each other, the train is leaving the station, they're getting all emotional, the bap has already let go of the hand and says, Ja, beti, ja. And suddenly what you see in the middle of the hand moving up is an iPhone. Oh my God, it just ruins the romance altogether. There's product placement, right? It's just horrible. Anyway, ruins all these movies. I mean, when I see that in, for example, these Marvel movies, it just irks me कि आप moon पे जा रहे हैं, कुछ हो रहा है वहाँ पे और वहाँ पे आपको Starbucks का कप मिल रहा है, जो भी है, it's absurd. Anyway, okay, so global consumer culture where people around the world are defining their identity through the objects and meanings associated with the consumption, that's very clear. But the consumption process is also being standardized. And this is very interesting, that the way in which you buy things, the way in which things are even organized in a store, the process of buying and selling has become the same. And the stores themselves start to look the same. So I had one experience when I was, my wife and I were in Thailand and we were in Bangkok, and I was all like, oh my God, I want to experience Thai culture and I want to know about, indigenous Bangkok culture. And there I was in Bangkok, and the only thing I could find was shopping malls. And every single, I couldn't do, obviously a lot of it was written in Thai, etc. So a lot of it was in English as well. But I felt like I was in London or New York or, it was exactly the same. And I was just like, this is cheating. I came to Thailand to learn about Thailand. I didn't come to Thailand to learn about American corporate culture, but that's all pretty much I'm getting. And whenever I would ask people in Bangkok, I said, what's a great place to visit? And they would always point me to some mall or the other. I'm sure that happens in Karachi. Oh, go to Dolman Mall or whatever, Dolman or whatever it is called, right? What's the KMC or what's the other one? Ocean Mall, etc. That's not Karachi. Come on, people. Give them something indigenous. Make them go eat the fish on the pier, etc. The crabs and the Kimadi. Yeah, make them go to Kimadi or something. That's still more authentically Karachi. But that's what's happening globally, is what's not only referred to as the McDonaldization of the world, but the Disneyization of society is occurring across the world. Everything is the same. Global theme parks, for example, become pretty much the same, with slight changes. McArabia instead of Burger or whatever it is. So what that means, of course, is that these places are losing their individuality and their individual and real authentic culture. And there is something to be said about not losing that. Not that every time that culture is absolutely perfect. Of course, in a lot of that culture, there may be honor killings or all kinds of horrible other things. But there's also a lot of stuff in your own culture which is worth exploring and worth preserving and worth celebrating and worth keeping alive. And sadly, that's not the case with globalization. In India, Walmart wanted to set up and did set up stores. Then there was a big protest in India by people who had small grocery stores. They said, we don't want Walmart. Walmart, go back. What does that say? Regulate and strengthen Indian e-commerce, etc. So again, it can rob an area of its individuality when you have these big, huge Disney kind of, McDonald's kind of shopping malls that come in and just create the same thing everywhere across the globe. It may be cheaper, it's more efficient, but really it's also robbing society of indigenous culture. All right, okay, so if you're tired, here's a summary of the entire chapter. This chapter is pretty much like a textbook, very easy to read. Dabbe bane hue hain, you can cut copy, you got a conclusion at the end. In case you miss the whole thing, just read the conclusion and you get what it's saying. So 6 things that could be asked in a quiz, maybe later today, who knows. 6 things. Global trade operates through economic production networks, economic and production networks, supply chains, global commodity chains, and global value chains. Commodities are often the first link in this chain. Okay, so that's the first thing to understand is global value, supply chains, economic networks, production networks, and so on. Number 2, some countries stimulate trade and investment through low prices and low wages. This is referred to as a race to the bottom, and in order to attract capital from abroad, and it's not necessarily a good thing, because what that means is that the welfare of the people is not safeguarded. There's more inequality, there may be more poverty, there may be growth without what we call development. Growth without development. People are getting richer, but the common people, the working people, the mass of the people remain as they were before, or even sometimes become poorer. Outsourcing is a very important and vital part of this entire setup of globalization, especially because of global supply chains. Of course, global supply chains can only be done when there's outsourcing, offshore outsourcing. National economies across the globe are highly interconnected through financial markets, and cyclical fluctuations in one country will have an impact on many others. Clear? Nothing new about that, nothing difficult about that. Global economic flows also include the movement of corporations, people, and ideas across both geographic and virtual boundaries, spreading a global corporate culture, a global business culture that is coming to dominate over other areas of life as well. Business culture comes to dominate not only over business, but it comes to dominate over even national culture. Consumption sites are increasingly becoming global, leading, of course, to the Disneyization of the world. Consumption patterns, structures, methods are becoming globalized, standardized, but one negative outcome of that, amongst other negative outcomes, the other negative outcomes can, of course, be that consumption patterns can be such that they can be very bad for the environment, for climate change, etc., income inequality, X, Y, Z. But one other aspect that's often perhaps not really considered by economists is the impact that such consumption sites, globalized consumption sites, can have on indigenous cultures. Thank you. That's all. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back for questions, answers, and comments and criticism.